Have you heard of HDR before? Do you even know what it is? Because I guarantee you don't, because HDR isn't just 10-bit color. SDR is not just 8-bit color. There's a lot more to it, and we're gonna find out what that is by me just dumping everything I know in my head on a virtual sheet of paper in color to show you exactly what you don't know. So there is something called HDR. You probably heard something called SDR. I'd like to say SDR doesn't really exist in the way that you know it, because you think of SDR as 8-bit color, right? And you think of HDR as 10-bit color, and you probably don't even know what these mean. If you do, that's great. Do you think of it like this? So you got HDR as 10-bit and SDR is 8-bit. These are two different standards, and HDR gets things really bright, if you know that, but it's not just bright, it has an expanded color palette. But let's talk about like colors. So most people, when they draw colors, they draw some kind of weird looking Dorito shaped color triangle, and that this color triangle is actually 3D, and so it really looks like this, but this would be the middle, this would be the white point. So let's just do it in 2D, because I'm not good at 3D apparently. So there's a color triangle, and the color triangle is made up of 3 colors. So there's red, green, and blue, and this is my triangle. In here you've got shades of green, and over here you've got shades of red, and over here you have shades of blue, and then when you combine them you get different colors. These two here make like magenta, this is yellow here, and then down here would be cyan, and these are your actual primaries. It's not red, yellow, blue, it's actually magenta, yellow, and cyan. So you'd have something like this, and then in the middle we're going to color white on white. It's just bright white. Now if you're using primary colors for painting, then it would be black, because more paint makes black because it absorbs more light, whereas with light, more light makes white because the absence of light is black. So I guess you could say outside of all of this triangle here that looks like a Zelda Triforce is actually just black. So you're probably looking at this and wondering, okay, so what does this have to do with HDR and SDR? When you're doing something, let's say SDR, all your color values are going to look like this. So you're going to have a red, green, and a blue value, and each of those has 8 bits of color. Now you've probably heard of something like 8-bit color, right? So 8-bit color is not what you think. Then there's 16-bit color, and then there's 24-bit color, and then 32-bit color. You might be old enough to have heard of 32-bit color as 24-bit with alpha. If you look at 8 plus 8, right, plus 8, that's 24. So when they say 32-bit color, it's not really 32 bits. This is an alpha channel, and the alpha channel is transparency. So this is basically the absence of color, not black, but the absence of color where the thing behind it will show through. So typically most people deal with 24-bit color because all movies and everything like that, you know, anything 8-bit is 24-bit color. So therefore this HDR one is actually 30-bit color in the same calculation. But if you add an alpha channel, it would be 40-bit color. So alpha channel would add another 10 bits, which would be 40-bit. You could technically have less bits of alpha. That's possible. It's just that's not how we represent colors and numbers when we're doing stuff. What would be interesting to show you is what 8-bit color looks like. So if this is 24-bit color, then what the heck is 8-bit? I'm assuming 8-bit color is something where you have 256 colors, because it's 8 bits is 1 byte. So there are 8 bits, and when you have 8 bits of binary, you get the number 256. That's how that works. So 2 to the power of 8 would be 256, and the numbers would usually go 0 to 255. So that means that if you had 8-bit color, you only have 256 colors. If you have 24-bit color, you got something like 16.7 million colors. And if you have 16-bit color, it's 65536 colors. That's what the different bits mean. In the past, there were a lot of games and things that would run faster on hardware that were designed for 16-bit color, like the Voodoo cards. And 16-bit color would only be this many colors, but it would look pretty good. Like, you wouldn't really notice, but once you get to 24-bit, you start noticing you could get more out of it. So that's how all this works. So 8-bit color is really 2 to the 8. 24-bit color is 3 sets of 8-bit color channels, which is a little bit different to think about. In Windows, it's typically represented as 32-bit color because it includes transparency, even though as far as I know, the 16-bit color did have transparency, but maybe I'm not remembering that correctly. So there's some color data for you. Now, we've talked about what 8-bit color is, but it really doesn't make any sense. So I said it goes from 0 to 255, right? That means that in here, there are 255 steps. That's how you choose your colors. So what happens is that in the dark areas, so when you have absences of color, so this is white in the middle here. The closer you get to white, it's kind of hard for your eyes to discern, but basically there are a fixed number of steps between black to white, and black would be the absence of all color. So 0 is black. 255 is white. White is the calculation of all the colors put together, which in the SDR space is 160 nits. Some people say it's 100 nits. I'm pretty sure, as far as I understand it, it's 160 nits. But I want to talk about these little steps here. So you have these steps, and they all go from 0 to 255 in each direction. And then any combination of those colors would show something here. Although looking at this triangle, you're probably going to realize something. If you have, let's say, 1 step of red, 1 step of green, and 1 step of blue, what is that really? That's white. It's right in the middle. But if you have 2 steps of blue, you would assume you're somewhere on the way toward the blue from the green and the red. So you might be here, potentially, because you have equal distance here, and then 2 here. So it'd probably like pull it into this area. So you'd get some blue. from that. But the blue might be tinted either way, depending on how the algorithms are set up for colors, because it's not as straightforward as you would expect, even though it seems very mathematical. And the reason it's not as straightforward as you expect is there's something called a gamma curve. And the gamma curve is there because these steps don't represent colors very well. And the places that our eyes are most sensitive is actually in dark colors, not in light colors. Because we're so sensitive to dark colors, it's almost like negative numbers here. So you have like negative blue, it would be even darker. You have more values of black when the gamma curve is applied. So you have a gamma curve, and a gamma curve looks something like that. And there are different gamma values. You have like 2.2, and the Mac, I don't know if it still does this, but I had 1.8, and some other broadcasts would have something like 2.4, and those are Blu-rays and things like that. It's called BT, like 1884 or something like that. You'll see it's 2.4 gamma, essentially. So these are different gamma values you'll come across in day-to-day. Mainly this 2.2 value, because that's Windows and most everything is designed around that. I think even Linux is designed around this. It's kind of the standard PC gamma, and then media is probably 2.4, but it also will look good at 2.2. This gamma curve determines how the 0 to 255 sets in here. So if we pretend that this is actually black on the outside, then you'll have more steps here and fewer as you go toward white. And the reason for that is this gamma curve. And that's because our eyes are so sensitive to darks. But the thing is, there are only so many steps here. And because there are only so many steps, you can't represent all the colors. It might seem like, oh, you have 16.7 million colors at 8-bit. 16.7 million colors is a ton, but it's not enough, because you might have 16.7 million colors, but only really X number are usable in dark scenes. And the X number could be 1,000 colors, or maybe even 16 colors in very dark scenes. So you don't have enough to look at, and you end up seeing these blocks between colors instead of smooth gradations because there aren't enough colors to represent that. That's where 10-bit color comes in. 10-bit color is 0 to 1023, which is 1,024 colors per channel, which is a significant number. It might not seem like much. It's like, okay, well, that's only quadruple. And that's also weird, right? Because this is an 8 and that's a 10, and it's not double. It's not an extra 2, it's quadruple, because the way bits work is that every extra bit doubles it. So 9-bit color would actually be 512. 10-bit color is then 1024. It's another doubling on top of that. It's not just 8-bit. It's significantly more bandwidth and significantly more colors. It's in the billions now versus 16 million. Now you've got billions. If you do 1 billion minus 16 million, you get a much bigger number than 16 million. So even just 1 billion colors is significantly more. Even 500 million colors is more than 16 million colors. And what that does is in different scenes of different lighting color, you have more colors to work with. You have a wider space of colors to use within the same confines. So let's say that white is 160 nits. So I'm going to draw a black box. This is white, W. That's pretty much SDR. So in this space, if you have 10-bit color, that means you still have SDR, but you have more little tick marks to use with 10-bit color. So that's what I'm trying to say, that 10-bit and HDR are completely different things. We haven't even talked about HDR. This is gone. Forget about this. Right now, what we're talking about is SDR. And SDR can have 10-bit color. In fact, it can have 16-bit color. And now I'm talking about 16-bit color, 16 bits per channel, which is ridiculous. So remember, it's 2 times every time. So this would be 248, 4096, 8192, and then 16384, 32 something, and then you get to 65.5, whatever. I think that's where you're going to sit at. So it's going to be like 65,536, that many colors per channel, which is like off the charts. That means all these tick marks of colors that are possible in the space that you're working in, you have more colors in that space. The colors already exist there. You just don't have enough bits of data to represent those colors. And again, that's why we have this gamma curve. And the gamma curve is different from a linear gamma curve, which would like go straight up. That's a linear curve that changes some stuff. That makes its dark areas look nicer. If you looked at anything that was linear, it would immediately go from black to extremely light gray very quickly, because there wouldn't be enough stops in between. The fact that my editor here has all these different colors in the black area, you've got this like light gray, lighter gray, whatever, that's only because there are 4 stops available. But if I had more stops, I would have even darker versions of gray, and even darker and darker and darker, and it would get so dark that you would no longer be able to tell the difference between them. So you could have a linear gamma if you had enough bits of data to work with. So if you had 65,000 notches, I should say, these little notches here of color, you might not need a gamma curve anymore. You might be able to just do linear because you have so many notches in there that you're covering more than you would have even with a gamma curve in the dark areas. And so that changes things if we start using 16-bit color. But right now we have got 8 and 10. That's pretty much what everybody's using. So that's what we have. There's also 12-bit, but then the next one's 16. They don't have a 14-bit or anything like that. There might be some instances where you'll see it, but typically it ends up being 8 and 10 for most of our purposes. And there are 10-bit monitors. They've been around for a long time before HDR, because 10-bit is just more colors in the SDR space, which gives you more to work with. But every TV and every monitor that most people buy is in the SDR space. Now, I say 160 nits is white. That is absolutely not true, because SDR is a little bit different. SDR has this weird way that it does brightness. So it looks something like this, and it kind of does something like that. And what ends up happening is you can raise this or lower this however you want. And so if you tweak your monitors to 200 nits, you can still get accurate colors in the SDR space. When I say 160 nits, that's if you're in a completely dark room. That's SDR. But if you have lighting in your room, like I do right now, then you can't be at 160 nits because all the colors are going to look darker. The way your eyes are going to perceive the light coming in from the sides is going to make everything darker. I do use my computer in the dark, but I always have bias lighting. And then I also use it during the day. And because I have this mix, I've settled on 200 nits for myself. The reason I use 200 nits is because it provides me with the best brightness that my monitors are capable of, with the highest quality color accuracy, with the lighting in my room. So the brighter you get with your monitors, the less accurate they're going to be, because it's much harder to represent those black colors or all the colors in the space with a much brighter backlight on an LCD screen. OLEDs don't suffer from this as much, but then there's a totally different issue, because OLEDs, the more of your screen that's bright, the less bright the OLED gets. So let me go on a little tangent here and talk about this real quick. So we've got an OLED here, and the OLED screen is a square here, like this. Okay, and we have an LCD screen. Let's say if this much of the screen, and it might be like a torch up in here, something like that. If these places are really bright at the max brightness that your screen can do, then on an LCD, they will be the max brightness, right? On an OLED, you can also get the max with something like this. It should be about 10% of your screen. That's the max brightness. I mean, if you get even less, you can technically do more, but 10% is what we look at. That could do max brightness. This is an OLED, and this is an LCD. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just explaining the differences between them, because if you don't understand this, you're not going to understand how HDR works and why games have something called HGIG. It's a set of guidelines, not actually a standard. It's per game that you would develop it. That's an LCD. That's great. You're at max, right? But what if it ends up being like this much of the screen is bright and this is much of this screen is bright? Well, with an LCD, you still get max because the backlight has not changed brightness. It's the same. So you get max brightness. But with an OLED, that's where it gets interesting, because the OLED cannot do max brightness when the whole thing is bright like this, or else you can get what's called burnout or image retention. You might be familiar with burn in. Burn in is a CRT thing where it's something like the phosphors get burnt into the screen itself. And so that image is there forever. And I don't think it's possible to get rid of it because it's burned in the actual screen or the image mask or something like that. So I don't know 100%, but that's what burn in came from. LCDs can have stuck pixels. It's not burn in. So that's why we use the word image retention now, because there are different ways of a screen going bad, and we represent that term as image retention. And what it means is that the image is retained on the screen, and it's done differently. OLEDs burn out. The pixels have a finite amount of life. It doesn't matter which pixels are used. If you have something extremely bright right here for the entire life of the TV, all the other pixels will be affected. Either this area on the TV will burn out, or your screen will do a refresh cycle and essentially dim all of the other pixels to match the brightness of this pixel. And the way they're able to tell that, as far as I know, is something to do with voltage and stuff like that. The TV's able to know, okay, this pixel is using this much power, therefore it's this bright, and because it's that bright, we're gonna have to shrink down the power usage of all the other pixels. Even though technically they would look normally fine, that prevents burnout on an OLED. So if you have a screen that is this bright, the automatic brightness limiter will kick in to avoid image retention, and it will change your peak nits. So if this was 700 and this was 700, what's gonna end up happening is that now this is no longer 700, now this is only 300 nits, and this is still 700. So there is a superiority to LCDs in very bright scenes. I've seen it on my OLED, but the contrast on an OLED is still significantly more, especially the brighter it gets. OLEDs have near infinite contrast, as it's called, and the reason for that is because black is black. It's not really black though. If your screen is not black, then it's not technically black, but it's whatever that screen is, that is the black, and the pixels actually physically turn off, so there's no light being emitted from them. Whereas with an LCD, there's a backlight, and the backlight is always on. Unless you can hide the backlight from shining through the liquid crystals, then it's going to make your whole screen gray. And so black is not ever black on an LCD. It's some form of gray. And in the SDR space, it's close to black, so it looks pretty good. But once you get get into the HDR space, depending on how your monitor is configured, you'll get more of that gray look to it, and you'll lose a lot of that contrast. And so that's a fallback of the LCD where, yeah, okay, you're getting 700 nits of peak brightness, but you're also losing 200 nits of your black levels because of that same problem. And really, you want to set these brightness values in SDR space, at least, based on your ambient lighting and your room lighting. And I would agree for the same thing in the sense of an OLED and an LCD. You want to set these values where black is located based on your ambient lighting. If you're in the sun, you probably want to raise everything up because black is going to be black. If we're counting in 0 to 255, let's say black is black up to 5. If you want to look at black, 0 to 5 is still black. But if you're in the sun, it's going to be something like 0 to 50 is still black. So now you want to raise your black level to basically be 50 for the lowest so that you can see some definition and contrast in the dark parts of the scene because the ambient lighting doesn't match. And this is all important because it's how SDR is different from HDR. SDR means standard dynamic range and HDR means high dynamic range. They're completely different standards and they mean different things. Now, we've explained how LCDs and OLEDs are different. We've talked about how I set my peak brightness to 200 because I actually have ambient light in my room and I'm not in a completely dark room. Therefore, I need to have my screens brighter, otherwise I'll be losing detail. And because I have them brighter, I also lose some black detail. It's less noticeable between 160 and 200 nits, but I will lose some black detail because of it. Just the way LCDs work. Now, if I was an OLED, I would lose no detail. Unless the OLED doesn't have HDR capabilities, you won't lose black detail, but you might not be able to get the max brightness depending on how the screen is built. Most likely, an OLED could do 200 nits easy. Most monitors can even do up to 300 nits of peak brightness. I'm lying when I say that because I know my side monitors can do something like 250 peak nits of brightness. My main display can do, I don't know, it measures weird. Sometimes I'm saying like 1600, but on Rtings they were saying 760. So I'm not really sure. I would probably say whatever Rtings says is true, but again, I'm not sure. I don't have the tools to measure it. I can just use my eyes and some tool that makes 1600 nits of brightness. But in SDR space, I'm not going to be setting it to 1600 nits of brightness on white because basically my black is going to go away. With 8-bit color, there aren't enough numbers here to be represented in HDR space nicely. Let's talk about that now. So HDR is something like there's like a triangle outside of here, and so the colors can go even further. So what happens is we had a line like this, and this is 8-bit color, and this is 10-bit color. We're not worrying about gamma right now because if we worry about gamma, I can't draw the lines correctly. So this is 8-bit color, and this is 10-bit color, and what's going to happen here is when you go to HDR space, you have more colors to work with, and there's something called wide color gamut. It's associated with HDR. It's not necessarily 100% with HDR. Let's say this is SDR here. If we're going to go into HDR here, and we're going to talk about this, the line is way longer. So the space between these is much farther. So basically we've stretched this out, which means the difference between this color and this color is much greater in the HDR space when using 8-bit color. And so you'll see a lot more choppy gradations. It's not going to look as nice. The colors aren't going to be as accurate. It's essentially what 16-bit color was in the past, where you only had 65,000 colors. Compared to 16.7 million colors, you had a lot more gaps between all the colors. And again, Gamma would come in and fix most of it, but it would still look really bad. And then you'd have 256 color. And that's where you have to use heavy dithering to make the image look better because you simply don't have enough colors to work with. Even with 256, you think that's a lot, but it's not enough. And especially the blacks, they're just going to suffer. I don't even think they had a gamma cover with 256 colors. It just had a linear curve and they just try to make it work. You had 16 color mode, and 16 color mode was another one where they only had 16 colors to work with. And so again, heavy dithering to make it look good, and they didn't even have that many pixels to work with. So they had to do all these little tricks to get more colors out of it and make it look like there were actually more colors, and they can use CRTs to their advantage because the way the cathode ray tube laser would essentially draw the lines of phosphors on the screen, they could use the fact that there's an image mask and make it look like colors were together. And then also the composite signal wasn't very good, and so you could make it have more colors just by using a different cable that wasn't very accurate, and then it would basically merge colors together because the luminance and color was, that data was put together. Lots of weird tricks that they did back in the day to get more colors out of less available 100% colors. But we're at a space now where we were in this 8-bit color and it looks fine in SDR, but 10-bit looks better. And then now we're at a point where we have this thing called HDR. So now I'm going to remove my arrow because we're going to talk about HDR. And HDR is like this triangle here, and it's way bigger. It's not even like close. I can't even draw it on the screen, you know? It's so big, this triangle, compared to the old one. But let's draw it like this, just to kind of show you exactly how big it is. It's something like this. It's this giant triangle compared to this red, green, blue one here that I drew initially. It gives you a wider color gamut because there are more colors to work with. HDR and 10-bit are usually said to be similar, but they are not. You don't need 10-bit color to have high dynamic range, which is why older video games had high dynamic range rendered in SDR with 8-bit color. They use something called auto exposure to make it work, but basically you would lose some detail, but then you'd gain it back once your eyes adjusted and the game's eyes adjusted to do it. HDR is a little bit weird because there are a few standards with HDR. There's PQ and then there's the HLG standard. PQ is actually two standards, HDR 10 and Dolby Vision. There are probably other HDR standards. I know there are. Samsung made their own called HDR 10 Plus. I have no clue where it fits. I'm pretty sure it's in the Dolby Vision camp. From what I've read and seen, it would fit here, but I don't know any content that's in HDR 10 Plus. It would be nice to have it when you don't want to pay license for Dolby Vision because Samsung made it. I don't think you have to pay them for a license to use it. It's free, which is great. So you can get essentially Dolby Vision for free through HDR 10 Plus. And so what are all the differences between these? HDR 10 basically says here is the lowest and here is the highest in our range. And basically all the content now has to fit in this container. And that's how your TV is going to be set. You can put a tone mapper on it, whatever. But Dolby Vision is like the tone mappers. We've talked about how HDR is essentially stretched out SDR. And the 10-bit color and 8-bit color, they don't matter. Well, all they are these little notches in between all the colors. That's really all they are. And the notches are actually smaller on one side and larger on the other because that's how our gamma curves work. Okay, now let's explain what these are. HLG is essentially SDR. That should make it super clear. We've got SDR and it has this curve like this. HLG is like this. You get more brightness on it. This is something, maybe this is a gamma curve. I have no clue, but it's essentially SDR with extra brightness in there. And what's cool about HLG is that it's already tone map for SDR. If you watch an HLG video in SDR, it should look really good. It should look almost like the HLG version of it that was in HDR. So HLG is HDR. SDR is not HDR, but if you watch HLG content in SDR, it should look just fine. And the reason this was created, as far as I understand, from the British broadcast company, BBC, they made HLG, which I'm very happy about because I think is a pretty cool standard that's not widely used. But HLG allows you to broadcast in HDR. A lot of these TV companies and airwaves, they only have so much bandwidth available to them to broadcast channels. And the larger the channels, like 8K is 4 times 4K. You get 1080p, right? This takes up a lot of bandwidth on the line compared to 480p, which was the old standard. Well, let's look at 1080. So if you look at 4K, so if a TV company is going to broadcast in 4K, that is 4 times 1080p. There are 4 1080p channels that have to be removed from your cable provider or your airwaves to be able to provide a 4K signal. And then if you have 8K, it is 4 4Ks. It looks like 2 times. It's not. It's 2 times X and 2 times Y. So it's 4 times the amount. 4 4K screens make an 8K screen. It is crazy resolution, just like unbelievable. And so that's 16 1080p screens. So you're saying like if you want to do higher resolution, it's going to require a significant amount of bandwidth from the provider. And then we have other problems too in the color space. 10-bit color? Are you kidding me? You're going to put those over the airwaves? You only have so much information to pass through. You already have a 4K signal that's using up 4 1080 lanes, and now you're going to add more color to it, and HDR, which is even more color possibilities. When they say HDR, they're talking about 10-bit color here. It's not the HDR specifically that's the problem, it's the 10-bit color. You're going to try to put those over the airwaves where you're already limited on bandwidth. Well, that's going to be really difficult to do. So that's why the HLG standard was made, and I think it's pretty cool because it saves a lot of bandwidth, and it could look nice, and it's pre-tone mapped for SDR. The HLG video, as far as I understand, is actually tone mapped into SDR, and it will look mostly the same as it can. It can't, obviously, because peak brightness in SDR, like I said, is 160 nits. That's the standard. You can raise it to 200 nits, but then it changes some calculations, but you can make it look nice in 200 nits still. You can make it look nice in 500 nits, whatever you want. But HDR is 10,000 nits of peak brightness versus 160. That's the difference between HDR and SDR, is actually the peak brightness. Not necessarily, because like I said, it's also stretched out. So HDR is actually more colors. It includes a wider color gamut, which is really a separate thing, but it's not a separate thing because these are all combined together in these marketing names and whatever. And so when you get content that is HDR, it will usually be in that space. And then there are video codecs and other things that come into play because certain video codecs don't support anything outside the SDR range. Therefore, you have to have a different codec like HEVC or HEIF or H.264 or AV1 or something that supports the HDR range and the peak brightness that comes with it, because it's not just the amount of color, but also the brightness of those colors. So let's talk about HDR10 again. HDR10 is this fixed thing. It's called static metadata. And it basically says my video goes from the lowest point in it is 36 nits and the highest point in my video is actually, let's say 500 nits. This is the range, and it basically would set your TV into this mode where this is the darkest and this is the lightest, and then you're basically playing everything within this range. And that's it. That's your static metadata. Now, you have to run a tone mapper on your TV if you want to get the full brightness of your TV within the content. Now, you don't have to. I don't like the tone mapper because there's like some weird curve like this for HDR brightness, and there's something called a roll off. They basically kind of nicely roll off the peak brightness on the video based on how it's set up with this metadata. It rolls off nicely, so it looks good even if your panel can't support anything brighter than that. It's got a good roll off where it won't look like everything's blown out on your screen because it doesn't support the brightness that it needs. It's possible to happen, but turning your tone mapper off doesn't actually turn it off. It just changes the curve that they use. The curve's not dynamic. It's a static curve, but it kind of has this roll off on it. Now, if you're watching 10,000 nits content and you got your tone mapper off, it probably won't look good. I'm mostly sure of that. It won't look good because the roll off's not going to roll off well enough. It can. It's possible the TVs are really made for it. I'm not sure. I've just never tried it. But I'm assuming it's not going to look very good, because if your panel is only going up to 700 nits and the game or something else is designed for 10,000 nits and you got this roll-off happening, pretty much most of the content of the game is not going to look good in bright areas. Dark areas probably pretty good, but bright areas probably not good. And this is the interesting thing, because SDR was all about dark areas and HDR is all about bright areas. But HDR also gets darker than SDR, and that's not really true, okay? But it's because HDR is using 10-bit color, so you have more gradations within the gamma curve for black. So the darks can actually look better than SDR because you have more physical colors to work with, not because of HDR, but because of 10-bit color, because of this thing going on here. That's why. You can achieve those blacks in SDR, you just have to change your gamma curve. They exist in the space. Like the triangle has the colors there, you just don't have any notches in that area. Let's talk about how this is affected. So like I said, SDR is as bright as you want it to be. You turn up your backlight, you just need to recalibrate for the new nits, and I calibrate for 200 nits on my monitors so that I get all the colors, but I get a brighter scene because I have ambient lighting and I want that. Now HDR is a little bit different because there's HLG and Dolby Vision. We've been talking about HLG here, which is essentially SDR, and it just goes brighter, and it can work with an SDR TV. You just pass it an HLG signal that's somehow it knows how to take it and make it SDR, and it's kind of pre-tone mapped. Now we're talking about tone mappers. What the heck is a tone mapper? Tone mapper would say 500 nits and 36 nits. That is the data for this movie. And what it is that my panel can do, let's say 1,000 nits, and it would be 0. So what it can do is basically any scene that has brightness in this zone, it will go from 0 to 1,000 nits. It doesn't have to go to 1,000, but it might. It could be 0 to 500 in this range. It's going to try to use your panel's brightness by tone mapping it. So every company does this tone mapping differently. You don't know what you're going to get. It's faking it. The designer said it's 36 to 500. That's it. But the TV is going to tone map it because 36 to 500 is kind of dark, and the TV can't get any brighter because this is PQ. We're in PQ space. HLG is different. HLG, you want to make it brighter, it has room to grow. It can do whatever it needs within your panel, just like SDR. You can grade HLG for a different setting. You can make it 200 nits. Well, HLG wouldn't be 200. It'd be more like 1,000 or something like that, but you can calibrate your panel much easier. SDR, I can calibrate it to whatever number I want. I can calibrate it for 500 nits. It still looks like SDR. The colors should look right. It's just gonna be really freaking bright. HLG is the same way. PQ is different. PQ is fixed. Your display has 0 to 1,000 nits of peak brightness. It will use the entire range. Now, like I said, with the curve, with the offsetting, it will basically do some kind of intelligent roll off, and basically roll off where it needs to. It wouldn't go up there. It would just keep rolling off based on the content. So if the content only goes to the 500 nits, it goes up to 500 nits with some kind of roll off. It wouldn't try to tone map that 500 nits into 1,000 nits or anything weird like that. Creator didn't intend. And you're saying, oh, what does it matter what the creator intends? I want it to be brighter. Yeah, that's HLG and SDR. That is not PQ. PQ is designed to be in a completely 100% dark room, and this is what you get. PQ absolutely does not care about ambient light. So if you have ambient light and you're doing any HDR content with PQ, you should turn it off. I have some lights, but they're very dim that I use in my home theater just so I can see, but you really want to be in a completely dark room when using PQ HDR. And Dolby Vision is a tone mapper. So we'll go into Dolby Vision now, because I talked about the TV doing this tone mapping, and it's not necessarily what you expect, right? It's going to change what the creator's intent was because there is a static set of information that's been given to it, and the TV has to figure out what to do. Scene by scene, dynamically. It doesn't know where the bright and darks are because you're just given a set of metadata that says here's the darkest, here's the lightest. That's it. You don't know anything else, and you have to determine that based on the footage, how bright and dark you're going to get. And there's usually some kind of delay, like 5 seconds or something that the TV will have before it does that. Now, monitors don't typically have tone mappers. I don't know any monitors that do. There probably are some. You're relying on that to do it. Now, I say monitors don't have tone mappers. That is absolutely false in some ways. The monitor itself does not have a tone mapper. Windows 11 does. Windows 10 does not. It probably won't ever get a tone mapper. And it makes a significant difference having a tone mapper, because if you're watching YouTube and you're watching HDR content, things are just blown out like crazy on my screen when I was in Windows 10. I was like, wow, this looks horrible compared to my TV or my phone. I think my Android phone is doing some kind of tone mapping. I think it changes the peak brightness and essentially shrinks everything down to fit into a space nicely when you're using it. I'm not exactly sure how it works because it used to turn the brightness up all the way when I would watch HDR content, and that is not the case anymore. It keeps the brightness slider wherever it was when I was watching it, but it's still HDR. But Windows 10, you will lose data at the top end because you don't have tone mapping. It's just gone. It doesn't exist in the OS. If Google doesn't tone map in YouTube or Chrome doesn't tone map, then you don't get tone mapping. You have to have an app that supports it, like a game. So you will get tone mapping in games, but you will not get it in Windows. And that's really important because, as far as I understand it, Windows 11 turns on HDR by default. So you really do want tone mapping, or else things aren't going to look good. Now, let's see what that looks like. So I wanted to show you this. When I'm in HDR, my monitor is reporting a peak brightness of 604 nits. That's because it's certified. It doesn't say certified, but it's literally certified. The monitor, I don't know what Microsoft is talking about here or what's not being reported correctly, but it is absolutely HDR certified at 600 nits. And so that's that's why it says the peak brightness 600. Now, Rtings was saying it's 760. Rtings is reporting my SDR peak brightness is at 500 nits, which is insane. See, this is what I was talking about. The SDR brightness can be 500 nits and it can still look really good. It's very consistent across different content. Great. So you could put it at 500 nits if you wanted to, and it would still look really good. And then your HDR, what they're saying here is a sustained HDR or a peak HDR of about 760 at a 10% and about close to that 100% window or a real scene 730 nits. I don't know exactly why, because as far as I know, monitors don't have tone mappers, but I was recording 1600 nits of peak brightness, and the reason I know 1600 is because I saw a scene in a calibrator app that was, I changed it to 1600 nits of white in Windows, and I couldn't see the difference anymore between the checkered blocks. If it's really reporting 1600 nits, then that's why. Now, if Windows is tone mapping it automatically, then that changes things, and so that could be why I was noticing 1600, because Windows is automatically tone mapping it, but it shouldn't in a game. I don't know if it matters if the game is in full screen or not, and how it handles those. It might just tone map all over the place. Not sure. So I have Windows set to the 600 nits because that's what my monitor reports. On my TV, it was reporting 1499. I had to manually set my TV in the customer resolution utility to 800 nits of peak brightness, which isn't exactly what's there, but it's close enough that I wouldn't notice if there's any loss of detail in the very white parts of the scene. This is interesting. I'm not seeing any difference here in the screen, but I'm seeing it on my monitor. I can see these blocks. I don't know if you can see it here, but I'm seeing these blocks here, and this is supposed to calibrate your display. But when I'm in HDR, and the problem is I have these lights on, but okay, there we go. And I'm just using a calibrator that Microsoft has that I found out about today to see where my peak brightness is. It's hard because these extremely bright lights on me, and I shouldn't be doing this with those lights on. Let's turn those off so I can get a more accurate reading. And I'm going to use this to calibrate my screen in Windows and see if that actually changes its value, because I might have new information for you. Okay, let's go dark. Yeah, I can't see any darker than this right now. I can't see any outline. So this is at 0.13. Okay, so it's not exactly 0, right? It's not an OLED. And then this one, I can still see a little bit. Oh, it's gone for sure. 100%, it's gone now. Can't see anything there. This is at 1770 nits of peak brightness. All the other way I was able to tell this is I use my phone as a camera, and I was able to take a picture. When your phone is in HDR mode, it's typically in SDR mode. And what it'll do when you take a picture, an HDR picture, is it'll change the exposure levels so it can show what it's seeing. And so if this is completely white, it's correct. If it has any detail, it's probably not correct, but my eyes can't tell anyway. Oh my god. Ah, my eyes. I'm looking at it in OBS. It's gray. I can see these gray squares. In my eyes, I can't see them. It's extremely bright. 1800 nits. This is where I'm lost it. Yeah, I can still see it a little bit, and it's gone there. And I can verify with my phone just to make sure. If the phone can see it, whatever. 1840 here. It's not exact, right? 40 nits isn't going to make a difference when you're this bright. So this is SDR versus HDR. I'm in HDR mode, so you should be able to see the difference between these two. If I record the video in HDR, which I probably will now, I'm on the default. Oh, so you can make a calibrated profile. So I just calibrated my screen. Display name, I would love it to say LG whatever here. Oh, I can totally see the difference between these two images. This one, I can see less detail in the sun. On this one, I can see all the detail. Wow. But it looks like I'm losing some color information. Like I can't see anything here. A big white mess. So I'm looking at the OBS window. This looks horrible, and this looks really good. The tone mapper in OBS. I'm assuming it's because I've got OBS set for 1000 nits of peak brightness and not 1600 or 1800 that my monitor is currently set to now. So it's not going to look that good. This is going to look better because it's 600 something, whereas this one is 1800 probably. Wow, that's cool. This is HGIG color calibration, where you set the 10% window and the 100% window. Then it can do some math to figure out if you can do this much at 10%, but only this much at 100%, this is actually your HDR. And I just calibrated it for Windows. That is really cool. I don't know why this isn't part of the operating system and is a separate app I have to download. But I wonder if the calibration setting actually changed anything in Windows for this display. It does. I have an IIC profile now, an advanced color profile calibrated for HDR. That is so cool. And now when I go into HDR, it's going to know what my monitor's values are. And I can save this too. So even if I remove my Windows computer, this is in the directory. So that was really cool. I did not know that was possible for Windows. Now the color was not calibrated. The brightness was calibrated with HGIG. Back to this. It's a set of guidelines for how to do HDR tone mapping, and Windows is in the HDR10 space. Xbox can do Dolby Vision, but in the HDR10 space, Windows is actually doing tone mapping. So your display does not need to, which is why in my LG TV, I turn on the HGIG setting because this completely disables the tone mapper. Off does not. You can still use off. It's okay if you have a Samsung TV, but HGIG is where you're going to get the proper tone map signal. Now, if you're in Windows 10, I don't know if I would recommend putting the tone mapper on, but you could still set it to off and that'd be fine. HGIG probably look okay in Windows 10. The main thing is that Windows itself is not going to be tone mapped, so you're going to be losing out on that in Windows 10. But games will be tone mapped if they include a tone mapper. Not all games do include a tone mapper. Some are set up for 10,000 nits, and they're only set up for 10,000 nits because they assume you have a TV and that you're going to tone map it. And so when you see the HDR in Windows 10 and it's not tone map, it's going to be really bad. And now, as far as I know, games don't get tone mapped by the OS. You still have to control control it in the game, but I'm not exactly sure about all that information. So Windows is in this PQ HDR10 space, which is kind of limiting in some ways, but it makes sense because I don't even know how you would get HLG to work properly in there. And then Dolby Vision is a tone mapper. So Dolby Vision is different. Now, let's say this is a timeline, okay? And it says at 0 minutes and 0 seconds, the peak brightness is 500 nits and the smallest part is 0. And at 5 minutes, we're going to change that metadata. So now the peak brightness is at 1000 nits and the lowest end is going to be 500 nits. So this is what Dolby Vision does, is it dynamically allows you to tone map on the fly. And as far as I know, you can put as many of these as you want, scene by scene, and you can switch them every scene. And it's something the artist or the creator has put into the work. And so it is a more accurate representation of the information that was contained in that footage than HDR10, where the TV has to fake it and figure out how to tone map it. Or you just set it to off like I do. Dolby Vision then looks better than HDR10 because it has more information to work with, and the designer has chosen where to put the peaks in brightness. So it's just going to look better overall. So that's the difference between Dolby Vision and HDR10, is that HDR10 has no tone mapping, and so you would have to do that. Dolby Vision has a tone mapper. The content for HDR10 is 1000 nits. Dolby Vision is graded at 4000 nits into a 1000 nits container. Now, I could be completely wrong on this, so don't quote me. I can be absolutely wrong. I'm just telling you that the HDR10 and the Dolby Vision data are slightly different, but both would be within 1000 nits, and Dolby Vision content tends to be graded for a higher peak brightness than HDR10, but that does not mean that it's supporting that. Like in Windows, I know there are games that do HDR10, because that's Windows does HDR10 for 10,000 nits. Something you probably don't realize is that your TV has all these modes. At least my LG one does. So there's an SDR mode, there's an HLG mode, HDR10, and a Dolby Vision mode. Every single one I have to configure separately. I have to recalibrate the colors and whatever in every single mode because they're all completely different. It means that when you're setting up your TV for the first time, you'll typically be in an SDR space and you'll set up all your colors and whatever and put it on warm 2 or warm 50 or whatever it ends up being to get to the correct D65 white point value. And you really should be doing that. You shouldn't have your TV blue. It's not going to look correct. 65 means 6500 Kelvin, and typical screens are actually set to 9300 Kelvin by default, which is really blue. Your lights are typically anywhere from 2700 to 5000 Kelvin, your room lights. And the 5000 Kelvin ones are those white lights you see in schools. They look horrible, probably because those don't have a high CRI. CRI is basically the accuracy of the colors from that 5000K of light. But there's 2700 and 5000. I feel like I'm falling asleep at 2700K, and so I only use it at very late night, maybe even on my computer. Typically, I will be at 3500K during the daytime, and that's actually where the lights are the brightest as well. It's a good mix between a yellow and a white, and kind of matches the sunlight during the day. Now in the morning, or if it's like raining or something like that, I'll switch into 5000 because it matches the light from outside more. It makes it feel like I'm outside when I'm inside. But the 3500 is where I keep my lights. 6500 is where I keep my screens. I had set them to 9300 Kelvin for like 10 years without realizing it because my screens were incorrectly calibrated, and my CRTs were always at 6500. When I put them at 9300, they always look blue, so I'd always have them at 6500. That was the default back then. I don't know why blue has become the default. I think it sells things in stores. It looks like it has more punch. It's less warm, but it could look a little bit crisper because your eyes are more sensitive to that blue light when you're seeing it in a very bright facility with bright white overhead lights, because those lights in that like Walmart and stuff are probably 5000 Kelvin, maybe even brighter. And in those facilities, having a 6500 Kelvin TV is going to look a little bit darker, not as nice, not as accurate. But when you're in home setting where you don't have these extremely bright overhead lights and you got like dim lights, or you just got the lights off, or you just got some sunlight coming in and it's a dimly lit room, it's going to look way better than it does in the stores. And that's because, like I said, your ambient light matters. The room is going to affect the way that your eyes perceive the brightness on the screen and the colors and everything else. Because if I am in a blue room, my screen is going to look more yellow than it will blue, just because of how the room is set up. So that's why PQ is designed for a black room, completely dark, and then HLG is designed like SDR, where you can just watch it wherever you want and adjust the brightness based on your ambient lighting in the room. Hopefully that gives you a good overview of why HDR and SDR are not necessarily just 8-bit color and 10-bit color. Hope you learned a lot from that video, all about HDR and how it's not actually what you think it is. I've got another video coming up soon where I'm going to show you HGIG and how tone mapping works in games, because it's very different from how it works in media. Thanks very much for watching. If you subscribe, you'll definitely get a notification for that next video. And if you like the video, then that'll tell me, hey, make more stuff like this. A video like this takes years of research, and then basically I'm just mind dumping everything I've learned over time here so that you can see it and figure out what it actually is and how it works and how it's relevant to you. So hopefully you like this.